Bienvenidos. Welcome. My name is Victoria Hernandez, and on behalf of New Era Alliance, partnering with the Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce of South Florida, we welcome our guests, members of the Chamber, and business and community leaders. Our esteemed speakers to this webinar on the topic of Puerto Rico's political dilemma and viable solutions, a very appropriate time to be discussing this, for this is November 19th, which, as you know, is celebrated as el Día de Descubrimiento de Puerto Rico, Discovery Day of Puerto Rico. This webinar is being recorded, and I will be your moderator for what promises to be a very vibrant educational presentation. This is not a debate over the various political options for Puerto Rico, but rather an informative and enlightening presentation. But before I introduce our guest speakers, allow me to acknowledge my colleagues from New Era Alliance, Robert Asensio, former state representative, and Dr. Nancy Lowther, educator and advocate. Joining me in this welcome is the president and CEO of the Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce of South Florida, who has successfully spearheaded the chamber for close to 30 years. Many of you here, I am sure, have had the pleasure of knowing him, Mr. Luis de Rosa.
Thank you. First, let me thank you and for your leadership and for taking this project on, as well as the New Era Alliance for their outstanding work on behalf of the Puerto Rican Chamber and the community at large. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the guest speakers for taking time away from their busy schedules. We're honored to have you, and we look forward to share some of the knowledge that you're going to be sharing with us. And of course, to thank all the participants who've come on and are dedicated to the Puerto Rican cause on the island as well as here in Florida. So thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our two guest speakers, Christina Ponce-Kraus and Rafael Cox Alomar. Christina Ponce-Kraus has been on the faculty of Columbia Law School since 2007. A Puerto Rican raised on the island, Professor Ponce-Kraus has researched and written about the U.S. constitutional history and its extraterritorial implications for American federalism, citizenship, and nationhood. Of special interest to her are the legal issues surrounding the political status of Puerto Rico and other U.S. territories, such as the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, U.S. Samoa, among others. Prior to joining the faculty at Columbia, she clerked for Judge Jose Cabranes of the U.S. Second Circuit Court of Appeals and for Justice Stephen Breyer on the U.S. Supreme Court. Rafael Cox Alomar is a law professor at the School of Law at the University of District of Columbia. Admitted to practice law in DC, New York, and Puerto Rico, Professor Cox Alomar has vast experiences in dispute resolutions, transactional matters, and international arbitrations. He has written extensively from the constitutional status of the American territories within the U.S. federal system to the legal decolonization of the British, French, Dutch, and Danish special jurisdictions. Currently, Professor Cox Alomar is the author of a soon-to-be-released book entitled The Puerto Rico Constitution. We welcome these two distinguished law professors who are here to give us the most current information on what is happening in Washington, D.C. regarding congressional legislation pertaining to the status of Puerto Rico. They have testified before committees already in Washington, and while they come from different views regarding the status of Puerto Rico, they have been working together, offering perhaps a compromise bill that I know that they are excited to share with you. To make our time here as productive as possible, we ask your indulgence on a few ground rules for this webinar. We will reserve questions from you for the end of our guest speakers' presentations, and we hope to allow a good portion of time for that very important exchange. So we ask, please, no interruptions or questions until then. Please make sure your sound, your mute button is on, and I will recognize your questions. For those of you who are familiar with Zoom, there's actually a little electronic hand that you can raise, a little button you can press at the end. If not, I will still recognize you. No problems there. So let us begin with Professor Ponsa Kraus.
Good morning to everyone. I want to begin by thanking the Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce of South Florida and Victoria Hernandez for this invitation. And I want to thank all of you for coming because everybody is super busy. And I really appreciate your taking the time to come have this conversation with us, a conversation that, as Victoria said, is not a debate. So it's an effort to be constructive and find a path forward for the island that we all love, Puerto Rico. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain basically what these two bills are, why two bills, and why Rafael and I have come up with a compromise proposal. So I'm sure some of what I will say will be familiar to some or many of you, while others might not be following what's going on as closely. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page so that we can then have a constructive Q&A session. So bear with me if you're familiar with some of what I'm saying. But as I believe everyone knows, there are two bills, not one, but two bills pending in Washington, in the Committee on Natural Resources, which I always find this so odd. That's the committee that has jurisdiction over Puerto Rico's status. The Committee on Natural Resources, these names all have histories, but it's still pretty weird to me. Anyway, that's the committee with jurisdiction over Puerto Rico's status in the House. And there are these two bills that are vying against each other, at odds with each other, both proposing a resolution to Puerto Rico's colonial problem. So one of them is the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act, and the other one is the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act. The Puerto Rico Admission Act is a bill that responds to the referendum on the island in November 2020. Which, as I'm sure you also all know, in which, as I'm sure you all know, Puerto Ricans voted, a majority of Puerto Rican voters voted for statehood. It was the first majority for statehood, but it was a slim majority. It was 52.5%. So the result of that vote led to the introduction of this bill in which Congress recognizes the result of the vote by offering statehood to Puerto Rico, contingent on a second vote, in which, once again, Puerto Ricans would be offered statehood, yes or no. And if statehood wins, then the president is required to admit Puerto Rico into statehood within 1 year of that result. So it's a pretty simple mechanism. A transition into any new status would certainly be complicated. There are details, not a lot in that bill, but there would be details to be worked out. But in terms of its mechanism, it's pretty straightforward. Congress makes an offer, Puerto Ricans vote, and if they vote yes on that offer of statehood, then the president admits Puerto Rico. The other bill, the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, provides for something very different. It recognizes Puerto Rico's right to hold a constitutional convention, and then it sets forth the details of what that constitutional convention should do were one to be held. And what the constitutional convention would do would be to debate Puerto Rico's various status options, define them and debate them, and then present them to the people of Puerto Rico at the conclusion of the convention in a plebiscite, offering the range of options, whatever options were produced by that convention. And then whichever option won that plebiscite would be presented to Congress. And the bill is worded in such a way as to express a pretty strong hope that Congress would approve the result of that process. So two bills, both trying to decolonize Puerto Rico. Rafael, Professor Cox Alomar, and I testified on opposing sides at a hearing in June on these two bills. I supported the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act, and Professor Cox Alomar supported the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act. So as Victoria mentioned, we do support different outcomes to this process. And we were brought in to support different processes because reality being what it is, the Puerto Rico Admission Act is supported by statehooders. It offers statehood. And the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act is supported by people who support options other than statehood. So that congressional hearing, I think it had in common with any congressional hearing that it is, I think, structurally designed to minimize enlightenment and exchange. At the very least, in our case, between the brief presentations and the sort of tendentious questioning designed to bring out support for one avenue or another, it really highlighted our divisions. There's these two bills and we are dead set against each other. But I heard in what Professor Alomar said, and I think he heard in what I said, a lot of consensus between us. We also know each other. We've been on many panels together. We have had an ongoing conversation about the future of Puerto Rico, and we know we can have a conversation that could lead forward instead of just highlighting our divisions. And so we talked after this hearing, and we decided that what we saw were two bills poised to torpedo each other. Two bills that have divided not only Puerto Ricans on the island, but Puerto Ricans in Congress. So the backers of the Statehood Admission Act include Darren Soto of Florida, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, the resident commissioner from Puerto Rico, Richie Torres from New York. That's Democrats and Republicans, as you know, Soto and Torres Democrats, Gonzalez Colon Republican, all Puerto Ricans with Puerto Rican constituencies. And on the other side, we have Nidia Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in particular, Democrats from New York, pitted against this other group, Puerto Ricans with Puerto Rican constituencies. And then on either side at the moment, I think that they have an equal amount of support, but these bills have divided the Democrats in particular. That kind of division where we're at each other can't get us out of this situation. So Professor Alomar and I talked after the hearing and said there has got to be a better way. There's got to be a path forward. And what we agree on is that Puerto Ricans can agree on the process. So that's what we decided to focus on. The process has to be fair, and it has to be inclusive, and it has to have the support of the majority of the people in order for this process to be effective and frankly, just healthy, fair, and effective. So we ended up writing up our views preliminarily in an op-ed that maybe some of you have read that appeared in the Miami Herald, in which we explained that what we thought should happen was that we should draw on the strengths of each of the bills and leave aside their weaknesses and put together a process that Puerto Ricans as a whole, we hope, could support. And so what is the process? We have basically taken what we believe is the strength of the Admission Act, which is its mechanism that Congress makes an offer and the people of Puerto Rico get to vote on it. And then the bill requires the president to implement the executive branch, and Congress would have to cooperate for sure, but the executive branch to implement the result. Okay, so offer, acceptance, implementation. We think that mechanism is exactly what Puerto Rico's decolonization process needs. But the weakness of that bill is that it offers only statehood. And opponents of statehood feel excluded. A yes-no vote, if you vote no, you don't know what you're voting for. And, we've debated the options for a long time, but we have debated how to define them. And there's uncertainty as to if you vote no, well, then what happens? Would a long time go by? Would there be some next step right away? What happens? So the weakness in that bill is that it offers only one option. The weakness of the Self-Determination Act is that it sets up Puerto Ricans to debate a constitutional convention. Those words sound great. But the problem is that it sets Puerto Ricans up to debate and then to vote on the results of that process, and then to come back to Congress in the hope that Congress will approve whatever it is Puerto Ricans vote for. But Congress cannot in advance promise to implement undefined options. Congress has to know what it would be approving. And even then, one Congress can't require that a later Congress, or even require itself in the future, to approve something. And so the mechanism in which Congress says, yes, we'll approve something in the future doesn't provide the same kind of guarantee that congressional legislation defining the options up front, offering them to Puerto Ricans, and then requiring the executive to implement the result. Now there's a guarantee. And so the weakness of the Self-Determination Act is its process, but its strength is its inclusiveness. Nobody feels left out. Nobody is left out of that process. It treats all the options equally. And so what we propose and what we've done after the op-ed that we published is we have actually drafted a detailed proposal, a detailed explanation of what we have in mind, and an actual draft bill. What we propose is that Congress offer not one, but all of Puerto Rico's decolonization options. And what that means is key. I'll have a few words to say about that before I'm done. Offer all of Puerto Rico's decolonization options to the people, defining them up front, describing the transition to the extent that it's possible to describe up front, because you can't do every last detail, but you can define the options basically with sufficient detail that people know what they're voting on. And you can define the transition with sufficient detail that certain questions people have are answered up front. And then those options, all of them, are presented to the people of Puerto Rico in a plebiscite. People of Puerto Rico get to vote. Our bill includes a runoff election. So if no option got a majority, then there would be a runoff vote among the two top vote getters. And whichever option wins that vote, the executive is then required to implement, either by, if it's statehood, declaring Puerto Rico a state within a certain period of time, and if it's one of the other options, independence or something else, then initiating a transition that would have to involve some negotiation between Puerto Rico and the United States. So in the last few minutes I have left, I will address a few issues that we had to grapple with in designing our proposal. So what are the options? There's a lot I could say about that, but I will just speak briefly on that, and then we can maybe dive into it more in the Q&A, or maybe Professor Alomar will say more about them. The options, in our view, are statehood, independence, and then there's a third option. So this is probably the biggest challenge that Professor Alomar and I faced in writing our proposal, because my position for a long time, I've expressed it in writing. I actually organized a letter signed by 47 constitutional scholars, mostly from the mainland, some from the island as well. We took the position that there are really only two options, statehood and independence. But there is an option known as free association, which in my opinion is a form of independence, but in Professor Alomar's opinion is distinct from independence. And so we had really constructive conversations about what to do about that. Because people who support free association, and Professor Alomar will correct me if I say anything that he disagrees with on free association, but people who support free association support it as an option that they would vote for distinct from independence. So if I think it's independence, but there's support for this option among people who think it's not, what do we do? And so what we did was we talked through how to define it. What are its essential features? And it turns out we agree on what the essential features of free association are. And so I can say more about them later, but basically free association would involve Puerto Rico becoming a recognized separate sovereign under international law and entering into a treaty with the United States in which it would delegate certain powers and retain others, and the United States would offer certain benefits, et cetera, and all of that would have to be negotiated. And the key about that arrangement would be that people would have to understand that either side can unilaterally withdraw from it. That's what I feel the voters need to understand. And we agree that with notice and following certain processes, either side could withdraw. And on that agreement, we decided to list it as a distinct option. So the options that we proposed are statehood, independence, and free association. A second issue, I'm just going to talk about briefly about three issues that we've had to grapple with. This one took less grappling, actually. The second issue was, should the process include the current option? So as most or all of you know, Puerto Rico is currently a territory. That's a status defined by the Constitution, well, identified in the Constitution. What the Constitution tells you about it is that Congress has what is known as plenary power, which basically means quite broad power, to govern territories. And currently, there's been a lot of debate over the years about what Puerto Rico's status is. But at this point, there's a pretty settled consensus with a little bit of disagreement, but not a lot, that Puerto Rico is a territory. The Supreme Court has said Puerto Rico is a territory. It's subject to Congress's plenary power. What does that mean? Congress controls the degree of autonomy that Puerto Rico has. That is a subordinate place for Puerto Rico to be. It's a colonial place for Puerto Rico to be. So the Department of Justice has taken the position that any process has to include territorial status, the current territorial status. And their claim is that they have to be neutral among the options. And one option is for Puerto Rico to stay the way it is. Professor Alomar and I agree that territorial status should not be on the ballot. It is true that the Constitution allows it. It does provide for territories, but the Constitution does not require it. And it is totally inconsistent with a decolonization process to include the colonial option on the ballot. That's our view. So we have written up a bill that doesn't include it. And I'm sure Professor Alomar would be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. The final issue that I will raise is the question of, there have been folks in the past who have felt that if Congress defines the options, then what's happening is that once again, Congress is imposing something on Puerto Ricans. And so what we believe is that these options have to be presented to people in the process of enacting the bill. There has to be discussion, there has to be hearings, there has to be input from the parties. We've drafted a bill, but we think of the bill as a working document. That's how we describe it. This is an occasion for discussion. And we conceive of what Congress is doing here as not as imposing something. It needs to hear from Puerto Ricans before it finalizes the definitions, but rather as making an offer that it owes Puerto Ricans. It has owed Puerto Ricans an offer for a really long time. And so we see this as Congress doing its duty, doing what it's supposed to do, giving Puerto Ricans a meaningful choice. Puerto Ricans have the right to choose their future, but their choice has to be meaningful. And that means the process has to be one in which Puerto Ricans can vote on real options that Congress can assure them will be implemented when one of them wins. So I think I've used up my time and I will leave it there. And I look forward to Professor Alomar's presentation and to the Q&A.
Rafael,
Thank you so much.
why don't you continue? Thank you. Thank you, Christina.
Sure. Thank you so much to Professor Ponsa Kraus for a very, very meaningful presentation and for her willingness to engage in this conversation and her willingness to engage in this effort to finally forge a consensus in Puerto Rico. Let me just add some context, both Washington, D.C. context, Puerto Rico context, historical context to what Professor Ponsa Kraus has just actually described. Okay, so this conversation about status cannot go on a vacuum, right? I mean, what's going on right now in Washington, what's going on right now in Puerto Rico that could impact this status conversation? Earlier this morning, the House of Representatives in Congress, by the slimmest of margins, with all Republicans against, passed the Build Back Better bill, 220 to 213. Very, very slim. And there are a series of measures there that could potentially endow Puerto Rico with parity in terms of Medicaid and the SSI, etc. But the future of the bill, of President Biden's bill, is highly uncertain as it now goes to the Senate. So today is November 19th. The Democratic caucus in the House is deeply divided ideologically on a bunch of issues. They were bickering all throughout the last few weeks. They finally got their bill passed. It's going to the Senate. In the Senate, the Democrats need unanimity in their caucus to be able to pass the bill through reconciliation, through the reconciliation mechanism. Let's see what happens with Munchin and others in the caucus, and even with Bernie Sanders. So the environment, and we haven't even spoken about the debt ceiling issue, which it's still up in the air. By December 15th, the United States will hit the debt ceiling. We haven't even spoken about the continuing budget resolution, which will expire as well in December. I mean, there are a bunch of issues right now before Congress and before the president and even before the Supreme Court. Last week, the Supreme Court heard argument in Vallejo Madero, looking at whether the Constitution requires equal treatment to Puerto Rico pursuant to the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment with respect to the SSI. So the environment in Washington right now is so complicated that it would be absolute folly for Puerto Ricans not to try hard to actually forge a consensus on this issue of status. Okay, so Washington, D.C. right now is, Washington, D.C. is right now in the midst of a huge controversy within and without the Democratic Party. In the meantime, what's going on in Puerto Rico that could impact this status conversation? Well, in the meantime, as the justices of the Supreme Court reminded us last Tuesday, my friends, Puerto Rico is broke. The government of Puerto Rico is broke. Right now, Judge Taylor Swain is still grappling with our fiscal restructuring. For the past few days, there have been hearings in the federal court here in Puerto Rico having to do with what to do with what's left of our public debt. Issues having to do with what to do with the pensions, issues with what to do with the University of Puerto Rico, issues having to do with what's up with Luma. Our energy infrastructure is in shambles. I mean, Puerto Rico is no longer competitive. When I was born, between you and me, 46 years ago, there were 18 banks in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico only has 3 banks left. I mean, Puerto Rico can hardly compete with its neighbors. I mean, we have, and on top of that, at the worst moment in our history, we are in the hands of the worst politicians ever in the history of Puerto Rico. The more mediocre politicians, the more inept and corrupt politicians that have ever been around in Puerto Rico, lo and behold, it so happens that they're in control of Puerto Rico right now. So that's the background, right? Professor Ponsa has been very diplomatic. She has been very gracious, not getting into that pandemonium, which I'm getting into right now. But this is the context. Now, and that's the reason why Professor Ponsa and I spoke after that hearing in which we participated on the opposite sides of the debate. And after that very contentious hearing, we had this conversation. And it became pretty evident to us that if on top of the Washington pandemonium and the Puerto Rico pandemonium and the craziness and the corruption and everything, if on top of that, you have 2 contending bills on status in the House, that's a recipe for complete and utter disaster. Because what happened was that the MPP was supporting HR 1522 and other stateholders in the mainland, and the anti-stateholders were supporting HR 2070, and we would be repeating our history yet again, canceling each other. We have been torpedoing each other forever. I mean, today is November 19th. Puerto Rico became a colony on November 19th, 1493. Now, the Spaniards didn't pay any attention to us until 1508, when they sent Juan Ponce de Leon. And by the early 19th century, when all of a sudden, there is a sense that, we're Puerto Ricans and, there's some distinctive identity behind being Puerto Rican. And since then, we have been bickering. All throughout the 19th century, we were fighting each other, the incondicionales, the asimilistas, and the autonomistas. Then in 1897/98, in the midst of the war in Cuba and just before the Spanish-American War, Muñoz Rivera and Barbosa were fighting amongst each other, republicanos against monárquicos. Then when the Carta Autonómica came around, they were deeply divided, both in terms of procedure and in terms of substance. Fast track. After the Second World War, 1945, there was the first semblance of reaching a procedural consensus. And be mindful, Christina and I are suggesting we reach a procedural consensus because obviously Christina, Professor Ponsa supports statehood, I support sovereignty. And obviously we respect each other and that's how it should be. So what we should aim for is procedural consensus and respect each other's substantive differences. Obviously, stateholders will be stateholders, independentistas will be independentistas, folks who believe in free association will believe in free association. There's no way to change that. All we want is for us to actually support the same bill and the same procedure, right? So what's going on right now? Professor Ponsa and I spoke in the summer. And in the summer of 2021, Chairman Grijalva had actually, and I have to say this, and again, Christina has been more diplomatic, but Chairman Grijalva, who's the chairman of the committee with jurisdiction over Puerto Rico, Committee on Resources. Again, I mean, very weird and undignified, I have to say. I have to add to what Christina was saying. I mean, the Committee on Resources, the Committee on Territories, the Committee on Cows, and the Committee on who knows, reindeers. I mean, that deals with natural resources. That's the same committee that has to do with Puerto Rico. But anyway, Chairman Grijalva made representations that he would actually have those bills sent to markup in November at the latest. That never happened. I woke up this morning and all of a sudden I see that Steny Hoyer, who's the leader of the House, I mean, he's the number 2, right after Pelosi, he's making a statement saying that forget it. I mean, those bills will not get any consideration. There will be, there's not going to be any markup. I mean, those bills are going nowhere. That's it. Boom. Nothing will happen. And that's precisely what Christina and I, we foresaw this in the summer. I mean, representations were made that there was going to be a markup in committee, and that didn't happen. And now the leader, the majority leader in the House is confirming this. There'll be no markup. Why? Because there are 2 competing bills. Do you think they were going to actually send to markup on the same issue, status of Puerto Rico, 2 different bills supported by members of the same caucus? So internally, Nydia and Alexandria supporting one bill and other folks in the Democratic caucus supporting Jennifer's bill. I mean, that was just a non-starter. We did it again. And the pretension that we could have gotten away with this was just ridiculous and shows a lack of understanding of our own history. And we keep repeating our own failed history, torpedoing each other in Congress. You know what? The easiest thing to achieve in Congress is to sabotage a bill. To kill a bill in Congress is much, much easier than to have a bill passed in both houses. And we have become experts at killing each other's bills. Okay. Now, what is it Christina and I are proposing? And she made a magnificent presentation. I hardly have anything to add. The only thing I'm going to add to what Christina said is the following. The procedural consensus Christina and I are suggesting is not unheard of and is not at all foreign to Puerto Rico's history. Because we are proposing that we should push in Congress for federal legislation that calls for a plebiscite where the people of Puerto Rico can actually have all the available options properly defined. That has never happened in the history of Puerto Rico. We have had 5 or 6 local referenda, but those are local referenda that happened in 67, in 93, in 98, in 2012, and in 2017, and then it happened again in 2020. But Congress was not at all involved in the process. And we have tried to achieve in the past, in 1945 and in 1962, and again in 1989, we tried to achieve legislation in Congress to actually have a federal plebiscite, have Congress involved, okay? But that hasn't happened, okay? For various reasons. We tried this in 1945 through the Tidings Piñero Bill of 1945. It did not work. That was at the beginning when the Iron Curtain was descending on Eastern Europe. America was at the verge of a new geopolitical paradigm. Independence obviously was not in the cards, even after the Tidings Bill. And the idea of statehood was definitely not in the cards for Puerto Rico. Alaska and Hawaii were there first. In 1962, right around the time of the missile crisis, President Kennedy suggested to Muñoz Marín the inclusion of the other formula in a plebiscite. And there was a series of negotiations between the Kennedy administration, Muñoz Marín, García Méndez, but that did not fly. That led to the Aspinall Bill in 63, which in turn led to the Status Commission of 1966, which in turn led to the local plebiscite of 1967. And then in 1989, as the Berlin Wall was just crumbling and the Soviet Union was just, collapsing, and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia were decolonizing, the 3 traditional political parties in Puerto Rico, led by Hernández Colón, Romero Barceló, and Berríos Martínez, they went to Washington to push for what Christina and I are currently suggesting we do. And there were a series of bills introduced in 1989 in the Senate and the House. There was a bill passed in the House, but the whole process actually floundered in the Senate. Now, Christina and I, we have had conversations about what happened in the Senate in 1990. And, we had different ideas. But 1990 and 2021-22 is a different historical moment. The idea that you could have a black president in 1990 was just crazy. The idea that you could have a Hispanic state in 1990 was just crazy. The idea that you could have a Puerto Rico with a free association arrangement that could be viable both constitutionally and financially was just not shared by many. I mean, free association wasn't even in the cards then. So the world changed. And the other thing that changed is the mythology of el Estado Libre Asociado crumbled, my friends. No one talks about el Estado Libre Asociado again in Washington, with the exception of Justice Breyer, who raised, what does this mean? An oral argument last week. But it is clear now that Puerto Rico, even after 1952, remains a territory of the U.S. subject to Congress's plenary authority. It is clear that Congress has authority to annul the Puerto Rico Constitution as it did in 2016 when it passed Promesa. And it is pretty clear Puerto Rico is, in the words of Chief Justice Trias Monge, the oldest colony in the world. I mean, there's no way of denying this. So the world changed, and we believe, and I think I can speak for Professor Ponce when I say this, that the time is ripe to seek yet again this consensus. I mean, the whole concept of political consensus in Puerto Rico has been very scarce. But we believe the time is ripe, and this is our last hope. And with those words, I'm going to end here, open it up to questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you both for excellent presentation, very informative. We have been receiving several questions through the chat process. And what I would like to do is recognize that some of the folks who have already submitted their questions. I will call on you, and if some of you have several questions, if you could just pick one question from your own list, so that we can give a chance to everybody. But so I'm going to start with Judge Torre Bayouth. If you can unmute your screen there and ask your question of our two speakers. Your two speakers need to unmute yours also so that you can respond.
Well, I asked some questions that sort of were addressed as the hearing, the conference progressed. But the problem I see with both bills is that, in essence, they disenfranchise a percentage of the significant percentage of the population of Puerto Rico that believes in the current status, and who are not being given a say because they're being told what you want is not good enough for us. It also guarantees that if those people in the middle that are for Commonwealth are what would you call it? If they don't see that their status is there for them to vote, obviously choosing either of the two options, they're not going to choose independence, and that will guarantee the other side the votes they need. But that's by not allowing that part of the population to have their say.
Okay, so your question is, what about the current status?
Yes.
Either professors, you want to respond?
I'm not saying that it's good or bad. I'm just saying that
It's not there, right?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll both want to say something about that. I addressed it a little bit, but I'll elaborate. So I completely understand that concern. Many people in the past a supermajority, and it's been coming down, but it was a majority for a long time, and now it's closer to somewhere around half or a little less, I'm not sure, support the current status, what's known as Commonwealth or Estado Libre Asociado, which Professor Cox Alomar was referring to in his observations. So on the one hand, of course, a decolonization process should include options that a substantial percentage of the population supports. On the other hand, it can only include options that are possible to implement. So the objection to Commonwealth status so the objection to Commonwealth status, let's put it in two ways. Any version of Commonwealth status that has been offered until today by the Commonwealth Party is not consistent with the Constitution. So the debate in Puerto Rico, as you probably know, for 70 years was over whether Commonwealth status involved a compact that bound Puerto Rico to the United States and guaranteed local autonomy. That's how Commonwealth was presented by the United States, telling Puerto Ricans, we have a relationship with you in the nature of a compact, and we now give you local self-government. And they implied, officials in all three branches of government implied that Puerto Rico now had a guaranteed governmental arrangement. And that already goes a long way toward decolonization. Now, we still had the problem that Puerto Rico is subject to federal laws and Puerto Ricans have no representation. So even on the best definition, I myself see that as a fatal problem with Commonwealth status. But Puerto Ricans did think they had something that, guess what? It turns out they don't have because they can't have it. Congress retains the power as long as Puerto Rico is not a state and not an internationally recognized separate sovereign. Okay, what I would describe as independence, what Professor Alomar describes in different terms, but either way, okay, a separate, recognized under international law sovereign, okay, as long as it's neither of those two things, it's a territory subject to Congress's power. Nobody wants that. Commonwealth status that's not territorial is not consistent with the US Constitution. Congress has a lot of power over Puerto Rico, but it does not have the power to guarantee local self-government to Puerto Rico and take away from itself the power to take it away. And so when you say, why not include that option? What people have voted for in the past is something they can't have. The analogy would be, I support statehood, but I want 4 senators. Well, if you offer the people in a plebiscite statehood with 4 senators, you're lying to them. A lot of them would vote for it. That sounds good to me, but you shouldn't offer it to them if they can't have it. So
But it's there. It's there. It's not that they cannot have it. It's that that's the actual status of the island.
Well, so that's
Why don't you explain, excuse me, I'm gonna take the privilege here of being the
Yeah, sure,
moderator.
absolutely.
So Professor Ponce-Krause, explain, you did have a third option, which you called free association. Why don't you explain that?
Okay, so I'll say a few words about that and then defer to Professor Alomar, who is even more of an expert on that option than I am. But when you say, just to respond to, when you say it's there, the Commonwealth option that's not territorial and therefore not colonial is not there. That is, it is not possible. It is not constitutionally possible. So I don't say that with pleasure. I don't like saying, hey, you people, this thing you love, you can't have it. But I don't think it's okay to tell people they can have it if they can't. And that's what happened for a long time. The United States saying, oh yeah, we're never going to take this away from you. And then, as Professor Alomar said, come 2016, they did. They put a board over Puerto Rico's legislature, which can veto, supervise Puerto Rico's legislature and government and veto federal local laws. Okay, they did what they had the power to do. They took away our autonomy. So if we're going to decolonize, we need options that are actually non-colonial, not subject to Congress's plenary power. So that's basically okay. And then this free association option, how is that different? So that's different because that comes with separate sovereignty recognized under international law. Puerto Rico would be an international actor. And it would have an arrangement with the United States that would be negotiated, and the United States would confer certain things. And, we can't predict entirely what it would be. That would have to be negotiated. But that, at least, is a non-colonial option. Because if Puerto Rico is a separate sovereign recognized under international law, then Congress can't come in and take away its autonomy. Congress can take away whatever benefits it's offering if it wants to. It has that prerogative. Right, but that's the same thing. If Puerto Rico is independent, the United States could offer aid and then it could take it away. That doesn't make Puerto Rico a colony. That's what it is to be independent. You have relations with other countries. So the supporters, so just to wrap up, supporters of Commonwealth who want, they want a binding compact, they want citizenship, they want permanent union. What we statehooders say is there's only one way to have a binding compact with a permanent guarantee of citizenship, and that's statehood. If you want that, you got to vote for statehood. And if you don't, you have to face legal reality. Now, there's nothing Congress can do about it. The constitutional reality is that Congress has plenary control over you unless you are a separate sovereign recognized under international law or a state with full representation. So I can see you're not.
Okay, we have a couple.
Maybe Professor
we have a
Coxa can
couple-
help.
No, that's okay. We have a couple of other questions from different guests here. We have Dr. Colón Lorien. You have a question?
Hi, yes. I think Ernest has been helping me, Ernesto, to answer my questions on the side here. Yes, well, I just wanted to understand the HR 1522. And then, so that's what you've been talking about, that there's two bills in Congress right now, and so they're just kind of ignoring each one? Is that my understanding?
They have not.
Yes, you must have missed the beginning, yeah.
Yeah, maybe, they have not moved forward. There are two. So I don't want to dominate the Q&A, but since I supported 1522, I'll say real quickly, that bill is one of the two bills that's currently in Congress. That's the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act. The other one is 2070, the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act. There have been hearings in committee. That's where Professor Coxa Alomar and I testified. But then there was a promised markup that never happened and is apparently never going to happen.
Dr. Victor Vasquez had a question.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for bringing this group together. I'm very interested in the compromise ideas of both Rafael Coxa Alomar and Christina Pons Kraus. I'd be interested to know, since you all have been talking about this for a little bit of time, have you shared this with these ideas with other individuals from the New Progressive Party or the PPD or anyone else, and gotten some feedback from folks who are actively involved in the status questions and the bills that are before Congress? And I'd be interested to know what that is. And secondly, if I might just ask if there's Professor Alomar, if you or Professor Pons Kraus has any ideas about where there are currently any free associated states that exist that might be of examples for what a free associated state of Puerto Rico might look like.
Yes. So the answer to the first question is we have discussed this with folks in Congress, specifically in the leadership in the House. We have discussed this specifically with folks in the committee. And we know that, and obviously we have discussed this with the staff of those supporting both bills, right? The staff of Alexandria Ocasio, the staff of Nidia Velázquez or Darren Soto. We have actually sent our proposal to the staff of the resident commissioner. And I know that there are other parties in Puerto Rico looking at this. I mean, right now, I believe that.
Do you have any responses, any preliminary responses?
I think what's going on now, there was a wait and see mode. Folks are digesting what's going on in Washington. I think that there were some folks expecting that some sort of markup would take place. That didn't happen. It has become clear today and yesterday and today that hasn't happened. So let's see how these things pan out. In the next few weeks going forward, at the beginning of next year as well. In terms of free association, yes, there are a series of models of free association around the world, such as, for instance, Greenland negotiated a new arrangement in 2009 with the Danish. At the same time, the Allan Islands and Finland have an interesting arrangement. Holland has an interesting arrangement with Curacao that was inaugurated in 2010. So the United States has 3 arrangements in the Pacific. Those are somewhat different because folks in the Micronesian Islands are not nor have they ever been US citizens, right? So that's different. But there are some case studies around the world, right? I mean, and free association is pursuant to international law and pursuant to US domestic law, in my estimation, a distinct status, different from independence, because under free association, you're going to have a treaty that basically regulates most aspects of Puerto Rico's relationship to the US, but obviously from the vantage point of Puerto Rico's sovereignty, and Puerto Rico could just stand up and basically terminate that relationship unilaterally if we wanted to. So would the United States be able to do so on the basis of their international sovereignty? So free association is distinct from what we have today. Today, we are a territory of the United States. I mean, today we even go to Congress to ask for permission to declare our bankruptcy, right? That wouldn't happen under free association because Puerto Rico will be sovereign. So it's a completely different arrangement that doesn't fall under the aegis of the territory clause of the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, we have another question by Angel Bosch.
Yes, good morning. I think that Professor Cox almost answered my question regarding the difference between free association and independence. And the thing is that most of the countries that he mentioned that have these treaties with different other countries, all of them are independent. So you have to be independent first in order to do have treaties with the U.S. or other countries. You have to have some sovereignty in order to sit down at the table and say, "Hey, the buck stops here. I don't like the way you're treating me, so I'm going to leave the negotiation." You have to be independent first. So he already answered one of my questions. And the other thing is, what is the fear? What is the fear, or just keep things simple and say independence or statehood? Muñoz Marin, when he put together the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, he said that this was a transitional status. Obviously, being in the comfort zone have brought to us a lot of things that we have all the benefits, but not necessarily all the responsibilities. And I think that like the Professor Cox mentioned, the Commonwealth is done in Puerto Rico. It served. I think that more time than they're supposed to. So, what is the fear? What is the fear of putting just to keep it simple and say statehood or independence? Remember that Puerto Rico, trying to summarize what Professor Ponsa said, we belong to, but we're not part of. So we don't have, the future of Puerto Rico is in the hands of the Congress, not necessarily in the hands of the people in the island. And those are just my comments.
Okay, do you want to respond, speakers?
You go ahead, Rafael, because I'm not afraid of just putting down statehood and independence. I'm just willing to put down a third option. So I leave it to you to respond.
Well, free association pursuant to the United Nations is a formula on its own. So if pursuant to international law, free association is separate from independence, why should we omit that fact? I mean, the important thing is not the labeling. The important thing is the essence of what these substantive propositions actually entail. Obviously, free association means international sovereignty. Obviously, you're going to be sovereign. Obviously, you're going to be invested with all the authority to make your decisions. And in the exercise of that sovereignty, you're going to enter into a treaty that has a rather specific provisions with respect to national security, defense, foreign affairs, diplomatic relations, commercial relations, etc. So, I'm fine with that. I mean, the important thing is to educate the people so that they know exactly what they're voting for and to make sure that they can actually exercise their right to self-determination. The problem with both bills before Congress, well, those defunct bills now, is that they were asking folks to vote in the dark. in terms of what the conditions are, the transition. I mean, and that was the fundamental problem. That's precisely why we're supporting a more precise proposal, a much more specific proposal.
I have a follow-up to that. Excuse me, I have a follow-up to that then. Do you have language in a draft form?
Sure, we have.
Compromise?
Sure, we have. And
You
we
have a
have.
sponsor?
Sure. And let me tell you something. I mean, and our proposal is perhaps, you know, much more comprehensive than many proposals that I have seen around. And it's public. You know, it's available. El Nuevo Día actually wrote about it last weekend, if I'm not mistaken. Professor Ponsa can correct me. And yes, you know, it's written in stone. I mean, the fundamental issue here is that we need to open a conversation, and we're just opening this conversation. Nothing is written in stone, but we have come up with a written proposal because, I mean, you know, in order to make proposals, one needs to be serious about what is it one is arguing and coming up with. And therefore, we have put our ideas in writing. Yes.
Okay. We have another question by Ernesto Morales.
Yeah, hi. My question is the most mechanisms that have had to do with decolonization and all the hearings in Congress and so on are always represented by the major political parties in Puerto Rico. And as Professor Cox Alomar implied a while ago, there's a lot of people in Puerto Rico that do not feel represented by the current political parties. You know, and so my question is, does your proposal allow for that congressional hearing process or whatever to include or to give standing to people that are not part of a formal political party? Because, you know, I honestly don't trust any of them to represent me. So, you know, is there a mechanism in there for me to have the standing to go to Congress and say, well, this is my opinion, so on and so forth? Thank you.
So I wish there were an even better way to ensure that every voice was heard. What we are doing on our end is putting our proposal out there. In fact, I just put a link in the chat. We presented it at the University of Puerto Rico. We've done radio interviews. We're going to do some more writing about it. But so we want it out there to be debated and discussed, and that's a discussion that is not, you know, dependent on or contingent on political parties. That said, I think that the reality of the matter is that the political parties will have a pretty dominant role, and we don't really have any control. I mean, we can make suggestions, but over how Congress and the relevant representatives themselves gain input. So for example, if there were a hearing, if this compromise proposal actually got that kind of traction and there was a hearing, I'm sure we would both say, you know, you got to bring in people who aren't just from the political parties. They have done that in the past. There is a concern to include more voices. And this proposal, you know, should get that kind of input like any other. But so in terms of how congressional representatives get input, it's, you know, one has to hope that the representatives who are working on these projects and that the committees that hold hearings would gather as much input as they can. But on our end, we're doing, as professors, you know, the best we can do to just get it out there.
Okay, we want to make some time for closing remarks from both the speakers, and then someone just sent this. Oh, okay. Thanking everyone. There was a chat. Okay, so for both of you, why don't you, you know, do some closing remarks, because we also then have some closing remarks to make. Rafael, why don't you go first, since you were the one that was second online, and then we'll have Dr. Ponce.
Again, Victoria, I really appreciate, your graciousness and willingness to open this conversation. I'm very happy to hear from Puerto Ricans in the Miami area. And I know you have a huge role to play in this process. And again, I know we are deeply divided substantively in terms of how to, where should Puerto Rico go in the final analysis. But I think we have the capacity to at least reach some minimum consensus, reach a basic consensus. And that's the challenge we have ahead of us right now. I don't know what's going to happen in next year's midterm election. It doesn't look very, it seems that, it looks a bit bleak, to say the least. Even the House could potentially change. Who knows? We need to keep going. And that's the challenge we have faced since the beginning. But if we do not join forces internally, we will never prevail. And we're going to end up like the 10 lost tribes of Israel, just lost in the desert for eternity. That's what awaits us unless we can forge some basic consensus. And I think the procedural consensus is the first way to go. Thank you.
Christina? I'm sorry, Professor Fonseca.
That's all right. I am Christina. So I too, once again, just want to express my thanks to people for coming and engaging in the conversation and for excellent questions, which I hope we were able to answer to your satisfaction. I would echo what Professor Cox Alomar said. We can achieve consensus and we must to get out of this situation. I want to add that it is absolutely a complicated time in Washington, as he said, and yet it's always a complicated time in Washington. And Puerto Rico has been a colony for too long. So, waiting until the right moment is not an option, in my view. We have to insist on this now. And Puerto Rican stateside, as he said, have a major role to play. And why is that? Because we're the ones who have representatives in Congress. So we need to insist that Congress fulfill its duty to decolonize. And then the last comment I guess I want to make is that I do find sometimes, I wouldn't say I found it in this discussion, but I do often find that the way we talk about status reflects this desire to sort of find the solution to all of our problems. And I don't think any status option is going to solve all of our problems. And when I say that, it sounds obvious, but I think it's something we really have to keep in mind. We're trying to solve a very specific problem, and that is that we are a legal, formal, de jure colony. We are subordinate, we are denied representation, and that's the problem we have to solve, and we have to solve it either with representation or with our own sovereignty and autonomy that we control. That's the problem we need to solve now. And a solution to that problem, I think, will be conducive to a solution to broader problems. It will certainly rescue our daily political debate from being held hostage to the status issue, which it casts a shadow over everything and distorts everything and always inserts itself into discussions that ought to be about the welfare of the Puerto Rican people. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you. We only have a few more minutes, so I hope you all have enjoyed this webinar hosted by the Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce. Thank you again, professors, for your commitment to helping resolve some issues, very real issues, political issues for Puerto Rico, and for your time here today. We can, after this hour, continue speaking among ourselves. It just won't be recorded for the record. If any of you can and want to engage in more conversation. Just the Chamber of Commerce of Puerto Rico has reemerged post-COVID to offer its business members benefits, such as the webinars we've offered these last few months. And plans are underway for those of you who are interested in other activities, networking activities, starting in the new year. And I would just like to have Nancy Lowther elaborate on a few of those things, touch on them before we formally end this.
Thank you, Victoria. And I would love it if you would put on your calendar, if indeed you are in the Miami area, the date of January 27th, when the Chamber will be holding its first in-person event since before the COVID era. And we have two dynamite speakers, both of whom they are twin brothers, the Vega Sons twin brothers, who have they are the children of Puerto Rican and Cuban parents. They live in Miami, and they are both young enough to be the children of most of us on the screen. They are whiz kids who have a new startup, relatively new startup called Lula, and they are going to be coming to speak to us about this new startup, which got $18 million in Series A funding. So they are movers and shakers at the tender age of 25. And they will be explaining how an idea that originated out of frustration about pizza delivery in a dorm room grew into a major company. So that is on tap for January 27th, to be followed in March by another in-person event to honor Women's History Month. And then we will also, because it is 2022, at that point, we will be hosting a number of political candidates from all different levels of politics. So we look forward to seeing you. Take note in the chat. The website for the Puerto Rican Chamber is noted. And we would love if you would become members and be able to join us for what is going to be really an exciting year, leading up in the not too distant future to the Chamber's occupying of completely new office space in Wynwood, which is the traditional Puerto Rican neighborhood in Miami. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. And Luis, any closing remarks? Luis de Rosa, where are you? You may have stepped out.
No, I'm not. I'm here.
No, there you are. Okay.
He was muted.
I was muted. I follow your instructions. No, I just wanted to thank the both presenters. I think they put forth an excellent argument or discussion, and hopefully we can somehow come up with a roadmap working together on their recommendations. You know, my position has been for a very long time, as you know, may not know, especially when we host the Puerto Rican Summit in Orlando, Florida, next year is in June 8th to the 10th, is that somehow we, amongst ourselves, we need to find a common ground. And we can have our disagreements, and you know, we have them within a family structure. If we do that, I think we can move forward. And I think this presentation contributed to that common ground, and I hope we can continue this discussion. So thank you. And I have one last thing, if I may, and I wanted to just recognize one of my board members, Rosie Hernandez, is on this webinar as well. So thank you, Rosie, and thank you for your support.
Thank you all for participating.